The year was 1878, and the silence of the high meadows was a living thing. For Esther Weston, it was a constant companion, a presence that had long ago replaced the sound of her husband's voice. Her cabin, nestled in a fold of the foothills, was a solitary outpost against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, a place she rarely visited, a place that had all but forgotten the quiet woman on the old western claim. Her life had shrunk to the dimensions of this small plot of land, a world defined by the rhythmic chop of an axe, the rustle of wind through pines, and the ghosts of memory that haunted the corners of her small home. Esther was a widow. The word itself felt brittle, like a dead leaf. Walter had been gone for 2 winters, taken by a fever that had burned through him with the speed and fury of a forest fire. He had left her with this land, a place he'd loved with a fierce possessiveness, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight in her chest. She had learned to carry it. She had learned to mend her own fences, hunt her own game, and stare into the flames of her hearth at night without weeping. She was resilient, not by choice, but by necessity. Her days were a litany of chores, a steady routine that kept the deeper currents of grief from pulling her under. She moved through her life with a capable, stoic grace that masked the profound isolation eating away at her soul. Her world was one of resignation, a quiet agreement she had made with fate. She expected nothing more than what she had, the turning of the seasons, the ache in her bones when the cold set in, and the crushing stillness of the nights. She was a woman frozen in time, held captive by a past she could not change, and a future she could not imagine. It was on a late summer afternoon, when the sun bled gold across the valley, that the silence was finally broken. She was down by the creek that cut through the lower pasture, gathering smooth stones to shore up the edge of her garden, when she saw it. A smudge of color against the green bank, something that did not belong. At first, she thought it was a deer, fallen and broken, but as she drew closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, the shape resolved itself into the form of a man. He was a Cheyenne warrior, that much was clear from the beads in his dark hair and the make of his buckskin leggings. He was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for the water that trickled just beyond his grasp. A dark, ugly stain spread across his back and side, a wound that was still weeping blood into the thirsty earth. He was utterly still. For a long moment, Esther stood frozen, the stones dropping from her numb fingers. Every instinct, every warning she had ever heard from the fearful folk in town, screamed at her to turn and run. He was the enemy, the savage, the reason settlers bolted their doors at night. But as she stared at his still form, another, deeper instinct took hold. He was not a threat, he was a man, dying on her land. His vulnerability was a silent plea that transcended fear and prejudice. Leaving him here was a death sentence. Hesitantly, she moved forward and knelt beside him. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for the faint, thready flutter of life. It was there, a fragile pulse beating against her skin. In that moment, a choice was made. The quiet resignation of her life was shattered. She could not let him die. With a strength born of desperation, she heaved his dead weight onto her shoulders and began the arduous journey back to the cabin, her world irrevocably altered with every painful step. For 3 days, the man, Vokin, existed only as a vessel of fever and pain. Esther moved around him in a state of heightened tension. The old rifle Walter had left her always within reach. She had dragged him onto her own bed, as it was the only soft place in the cabin, and worked with a grim determination she hadn't felt in years. She tore strips from her own linen sheets for bandages, boiled water for cleaning the wound, a deep, jagged gash that looked to have been made by a hunter's knife, and brewed bitter willow bark tea by dins for thiever, forcing the liquid past his cracked lips. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, was now filled with the sound of his labored breathing and the low, guttural moans that escaped him during the worst of the fever dreams. She was a stranger to him, and he to her. In those first days, Her actions were purely functional, a clinical response to a physical need. She was not nursing a man, she was fighting a death. She was wary, watching his face for any sign of waking, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. What had she done? What trouble had she invited over her threshold? When he finally woke, it was without warning. His eyes, dark and deep as a forest pool, snapped open and fixed on her. The fever had broken, but a sharp, intelligent awareness had taken its place. He said nothing. He simply watched her, his gaze tracking her every movement as she stoked the fire, his expression unreadable, guarded. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was a taut wire stretched between them, humming with suspicion. They had no words. His language was a mystery to her and hers to him. Communication became a careful, deliberate dance of gesture and observation. When she brought him a bowl of broth, he would watch her hands, her face, before slowly reaching for it. When he needed to rise, a slight inclination of his head was his only request. She would help him, her touch firm and impersonal, and he would accept her aid with a stoic stillness that revealed nothing. It was an uneasy truce, a coexistence born of his profound weakness and her reluctant, stubborn compassion. She saw the warrior in the hard lines of his face and the coiled strength in his body, even as he lay injured. He, in turn, saw a lone white woman, an anomaly in this wild land, and he did not yet know if she was his savior or his captor. Days bled into a week, and a fragile rhythm began to establish itself in the small cabin. The taut wire of suspicion slowly began to slacken, replaced by a quiet, watchful understanding. Vokin's strength returned in small increments. First, he was able to sit up on his own, his back straight and proud, despite the pain that surely lingered. Then, he was walking, limping slowly around the confines of the single room, his eyes taking in every detail of her life, the worn rocking chair where she mended clothes, the small shelf of Walter's books she could not bring herself to discard, the faded photograph of a smiling couple on the mantelpiece. He began to contribute in small, silent ways. One afternoon, he took a piece of kindling and, with a small knife she had left on the table, began to carve. By evening, he had fashioned a new, more efficient handle for her water bucket. Another day, as she struggled to set a snare near the woods, he came up behind her and, with a few deft movements of his hands, showed her how to tie a knot that was both simpler and more effective. He never spoke, but his actions were a language all their own, a language of competence and shared existence. The sharing of meals became their most important ritual. They would eat in silence, sitting at the small wooden table, the fire crackling in the hearth. But the silence was different now. It was less a barrier and more a shared space. It was in these moments that Esther found herself breaking her own long-held silence. Knowing he could not understand the words, she began to talk to him. She told him about Walter, about the dreams they had for the land, about the crushing weight of her loneliness since his passing. The words poured out of her, a confession to the uncomprehending air, a release of pressure that she hadn't known she was holding. He would just listen, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his expression softening with an empathy that seemed to transcend language. He might not have understood the words, but he understood the sorrow. He saw the grief that clung to her like a shroud. One evening, a storm rolled in, the wind howling like a grieving animal and rattling the very bones of the cabin. A sudden, sharp clap of thunder made Esther jump, a small cry escaping her lips. In the flickering firelight, she saw Vokin flinch, his hand going to his side where the wound was healing. In his eyes, for a fleeting moment, she saw not a stoic warrior, but a man haunted by his own pain, his own losses. The barrier between them crumbled a little more. She saw his humanity, and he saw her fear. A few nights later, the ultimate test of their fragile trust arrived. A cougar, drawn by the scent of the smoked meat hanging outside, began to circle the cabin. Its scream ripped through the night, a terrifying sound that sent a chill down Esther's spine. She grabbed the rifle, her hands trembling. But before she could unbolt the door, Vokin was on his feet. He took a burning brand from the fire, his movements swift and economical. Ignoring her panicked gesture to stay, he opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. There was a furious snarl, a shower of sparks as he thrust the flame forward, and then a heavy thud as the cougar retreated into the trees. He returned to the cabin, his face grim but calm, and bolted the door behind him. He had placed himself between her and the danger without hesitation. In that moment, she stopped seeing him as a wounded man she was caring for. She saw him as a protector. He was no longer just a presence in her home, he was a partner in her survival. The fragile peace they had built was not destined to last. It was shattered by the arrival of two men, trappers by the look of them, their faces weathered and their eyes holding a mean, calculating glint. Their names were Amos and Garrett Callahan, brothers who roamed the high country with a proprietary air, viewing anything and anyone weaker than them as theirs for the taking. They had seen the smoke from her chimney and approached her cabin with an unwelcome familiarity. "Just checking on the widow," Amos said, his voice a gravelly drawl as he leaned against her porch railing, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Gets lonely out here for a woman on her own." Esther stood in the doorway, the rifle held loosely but purposefully in her hands. "I'm fine, Mr. Callahan, I need nothing." Garrett, the larger and more brutish of the two, peered past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "Smells like you got company," he grunted, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He had noticed the extra bowl on the table, the scent of the herbs she used for Vokin's poultice. "Got a secret, have we, Mistress Weston?" The air grew thick with menace. Esther's heart pounded. She knew these men, knew their reputation for cruelty. They represented the very prejudice and violence that she had chosen to defy. Before she could form a response, a shadow fell across the doorway from within. Vokin stepped forward, his limp barely noticeable, his presence filling the space beside her. He was unarmed, clad only in his leggings and the bandages she had wrapped around his torso, but he stood with an unshakable stillness, his eyes fixed on the two trappers with an intensity that was more threatening than any weapon. The Callahan's eyes widened, first in shock, then in a vile, triumphant rage. "Well, I'll be—" Amos spat, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "A redskin. Hiding out with an Indian lover, are you? We heard stories about a Cheyenne buck getting cut up down by the river. Looks like we found him." The situation had escalated beyond her control. Her act of private compassion was now a public crime in their eyes. The men saw her not as a healer, but as a traitor to her own kind. Vokin understood the danger in their expressions, the poison in their words, even if he didn't know their meaning. He took a half step in front of Esther, a silent, protective gesture that only further enraged the brothers. "You best send him out," Garrett snarled, his own weapon now drawn, "or we'll burn this cabin down around the both of you." They stood there, a tense standoff at the edge of the wilderness. The brothers were driven by hate and greed, Esther by a fierce, newfound resolve, and Vokin by an ancient code of honor. He had brought this danger to her door, and he would not let her face it alone. The trappers eventually backed away, their threats hanging in the air like poison. "We'll be back," Amos promised. "And we'll bring friends. The town will want to hear about this." The aftermath of the confrontation was a heavy, somber silence. The immediate danger had passed, but a larger one loomed. Vokin knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that he had to leave. His presence was a brand on her, a mark that would bring violence and ostracization down upon her head. He began to gather his few things, the knife he had used for carving, a small pouch of herbs he had recognized from the woods. Esther watched him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She didn't want him to go. The thought of returning to the suffocating silence, the crushing loneliness, was unbearable. But she knew he was right. His departure was a painful necessity. As he stood by the door, ready to leave, he turned to her. He reached out and gently touched the faint lines of worry on her forehead, his gesture more articulate than any words could ever be. It was a touch of gratitude, of respect, of a sorrowful farewell. But fate, it seemed, had one more trial for them. As he opened the door, the Callahan brothers stood there, their faces contorted with malice. They had not gone for help. They had simply waited, their impatience and cruelty getting the better of them. Garrett lunged forward, grabbing for Esther. In that instant, everything changed. The passive widow, the grieving woman who had let life happen to her, vanished. With a cry of rage, Esther brought the stock of her rifle up, cracking it hard against Garrett's jaw. He staggered back, howling in pain. At the same time, Vokeen moved with the fluid grace of a striking snake. He was no longer a patient recovering from a wound. He was a warrior in his element. He disarmed Amos with a swift, brutal movement, sending the pistol flying into the dirt. The fight was short and savage. It was not a battle of equals, but a collision of calculated violence and desperate ferocity. Vokeen used his skill, his speed, his intimate knowledge of combat. Esther used her knowledge of her home, kicking over a woodpile to trip one brother, using the heavy iron skillet from the hearth as a weapon against the other. They fought together, a seamless, unspoken partnership forged in the crucible of shared danger. They did not kill the Callahans. They broke them, leaving them battered and whimpering in the dirt, their arrogance shattered. "Go," Esther gasped, pointing the rifle at them. "And if you ever come back here, I will not be so merciful." The trappers scrambled away, disappearing into the twilight. Like the cowards they were, the threat was neutralized, but the victory was bittersweet. Now, his departure was not just necessary, it was cemented. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound, aching respect. He had seen her strength, her fire. He placed his hand over his heart, then extended it towards her, a gesture of honor, a promise. Then, without another look back, he limped into the darkening forest and was gone. Esther stood in the doorway of her silent cabin, the scent of violence still hanging in the air, and for the first time in a long time, she was truly, utterly alone again. But this time, the loneliness felt different. It was the quiet after a storm, not the stillness of a tomb. She had fought, and she had won. The seasons turned. Summer bled into the fiery colors of autumn, and autumn gave way to the stark, white silence of winter. Esther lived with the consequences of her choices. The Callahans, it seemed, had spread their poison. The few times she made the long ride to town for supplies, she was met with cold shoulders and hostile glares. Whispers followed her like shadows. She was the woman who had harbored a savage, the widow who had betrayed her own. The isolation she had once felt as a circumstance of geography now became a wall of prejudice, built brick by the fear and judgment of others. But something inside her had been reforged in the fire of that conflict. She no longer felt the passive sorrow that had defined her widowhood. She faced the town's contempt with a quiet dignity. She faced the harsh winter with a hardened resolve. The silence of her cabin was no longer an oppressive weight. It was filled with the echo of his presence, the memory of their shared fight for survival. She found herself speaking to him sometimes, her voice soft in the stillness, as if he were just in the next room. His memory was not a ghost that haunted her, it was a beacon that gave her strength. One day in early spring, when the snow was finally melting and the land was reawakening, she saw them, a procession of riders on the ridge overlooking her valley. At first, a cold dread seized her. She thought it was a war party, perhaps come to avenge the wounded warrior she had helped. She grabbed her rifle and stood her ground, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But as they drew closer, she saw they carried no signs of war. They rode slowly, deliberately, with a solemn purpose. At their head rode a man who sat his horse with an undeniable authority. He was dressed not in the simple leggings of a lone warrior, but in the magnificent regalia of a chief, full headdress of eagle feathers that trailed behind him, a breastplate of polished bone, and buckskins adorned with intricate quillwork. As he came nearer, her breath caught in her throat. Beneath the majesty of the chief, she recognized the eyes. They were the same dark, intelligent eyes that had watched her across the fire, the same eyes that had held a universe of unspoken pain and respect. It was Vokin. He halted his horse, a respectful distance from her cabin. Another warrior, slightly older, rode forward and dismounted. He spoke to her in halting, carefully pronounced English. "Our chief, Vokin, sends his greetings to the woman of the strong heart," the man said. "His father has journeyed to the spirit world. He is now chief of our people." Esther could only stare, speechless, at the man who had left her as a wounded fugitive and returned as a leader of his nation. Vokin dismounted and walked toward her. He stopped before her and spoke in his own tongue, his voice deep and resonant. The warrior translated. "He says he never forgot your courage. He says you saved his life, and then you fought beside him as a warrior would. He says his people value honor above all things. You have shown the greatest honor." Vokin looked at her, his expression serious and yet profoundly gentle. He continued to speak, his words translated in a soft cadence. "He says a chief must have a strong woman by his side, a woman with a heart as brave as any warrior, a woman who knows how to heal and how to fight, a woman who is not afraid." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "He asks you to leave this place of sorrow and judgment. He asks you to come with him, to be his wife, to be a mother to his people. He offers you a home where you will be honored, not shunned. He offers you a place at his side." Tears welled in Esther's eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming release. She looked at the small, lonely cabin, a place that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. She looked at the distant mountains that marked the way to town, a place that had offered her nothing but scorn. And then she looked at Vokin, the chief, her friend, the man who saw her not as a broken widow or a traitor, but as a woman of strength and worth. She needed no translator to give her answer. She simply walked forward and placed her hand in his. A smile, the first true, unguarded smile in years, touched her lips. She was leaving everything she had known behind, but she was not losing a thing. She was walking away from a life of silence and into a future of purpose. As she rode away from the cabin, seated on a horse beside her chief, she did not look back. She was no longer Esther Weston, the lonely widow of the high meadows. She was a woman who had found her resilience, her strength, and her home in the most unexpected of hearts. She was a queen in her own right, riding toward the dawn.